As I sat alone in the dimly lit airport terminal, the eerie silence of the night enveloped me. It was past midnight, and the only company I had were the flickering fluorescent lights and the occasional distant hum of a plane taking off or landing. I clutched my carry-on bag tightly, waiting for my red-eye flight that seemed like an eternity away. Little did I know that this night at the airport would turn into a true horror story. The airport, an aging relic from the past, had an unsettling atmosphere. The walls were adorned with faded posters and signs that looked like they hadn't been updated since the 1970s. I shivered, not from the cold, but from the unsettling feeling that something was amiss. As the minutes dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I scanned the terminal, but there was no one around, not even a lone security guard making rounds. My unease grew as I pulled my coat tighter around me. Just when I was about to dismiss my paranoia as mere exhaustion, I heard it, a faint, distant whisper. At first, I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a woman's voice, pleading for help. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, trying to pinpoint the source of the eerie voice. The whisper grew louder, and it seemed to be coming from a dark corridor leading to an abandoned section of the airport. The hallway was barely lit, and the flickering lights cast eerie shadows that danced along the walls. Against my better judgment, curiosity got the better of me, and I cautiously approached the corridor. As I ventured further into the darkness, the voice became clearer, and the words sent shivers down my spine. It was a woman's voice, crying out in despair, "Please, help me. I'm trapped." I couldn't see anyone, but the voice was undeniable, coming from one of the closed-off rooms. Panic set in as I realized there might be someone in real trouble. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911, reporting the situation and my location. With the dispatcher on the line, I approached the door to the room from which the voice emanated. It was an old, rusted door with peeling paint, and as I turned the handle, it creaked open slowly, revealing a pitch-black room. I hesitated at the threshold, my heart pounding in my chest, but the urgency of the voice compelled me to step inside. My phone's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a room filled with dusty, broken furniture. It was like a time capsule from a bygone era. The voice led me to a corner where an old wooden desk stood. The voice was now clearer than ever, and I realized it was coming from inside the desk's drawers. I cautiously pulled open one of the drawers, and there, amidst moth-eaten papers and decaying books, was a tarnished locket. As I picked up the locket, the voice pleaded, "Please, find my daughter. She's still out there, lost in the airport." Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized that the voice belonged to a mother who had been searching for her missing child for decades. I promised to do everything in my power to help, vowing to find her daughter and reunite them. I exited the room and rushed to the nearest airport staff I could find, telling them about the situation and the locket I had discovered. They were skeptical but agreed to check their records and surveillance footage. As I waited with bated breath, the airport staff returned with shocking news. They had found an entry in their records from the late 1970s about a missing child, a little girl who had disappeared without a trace one stormy night. The details matched the locket's inscription, confirming the mother's claim. The airport staff and I scoured through old newspapers and documents, piecing together the tragic story. The little girl, named Emily, had been separated from her mother while waiting for a flight during a violent thunderstorm. Despite extensive searches and investigations, she had never been found. Determined to solve the mystery and bring closure to the grieving mother, I decided to delve deeper into the airport's history. I discovered that there had been numerous reports of strange occurrences and eerie sightings at the airport over the years. People had claimed to see shadowy figures, hear disembodied voices, and experience inexplicable phenomena. As I delved into these accounts, a chilling pattern emerged. Many of the incidents were connected to the same abandoned wing of the airport, the very area where I had found the locket and heard the voice. It seemed that Emily's restless spirit was not alone in haunting the airport. With the help of a local historian, I learned that the airport had been built on land that once housed an orphanage in the late 1800s. Tragedy had struck when a fire consumed the orphanage, claiming the lives of several children, including Emily. The historian believed that the spirits of those lost children, unable to find peace, had lingered in the airport, searching for their families and the love they had never known in life. Emily's mother, who had spent her life searching for her daughter, had become a part of that spectral tapestry. Determined to help Emily's spirit find peace and reunite with her mother, I embarked on a mission to bring their story to light. With the assistance of paranormal investigators and mediums, we conducted a series of seances and rituals in the abandoned wing of the airport. The events that unfolded during these sessions were both harrowing and heart-wrenching. During one seance, the mediums made contact with Emily's spirit, and she spoke through them, tearfully expressing her longing for her mother's embrace. Her voice filled the room, and a cold breeze swept through, sending chills down our spines. In another session, we communicated with Emily's mother, who had passed away years ago. She conveyed her gratitude for the efforts to find her daughter and begged for forgiveness, blaming herself for the tragic night they were separated. As the sessions continued, we uncovered more about the other lost souls that haunted the airport. They too had stories of sorrow and longing, and they all yearned for resolution and the opportunity to move on. Over time, we managed to piece together enough information to lead us to Emily's final resting place, an unmarked grave in a nearby cemetery. With the family's permission, we exhumed her remains and held a proper funeral, reuniting her with her mother in death. It was a bittersweet moment, marked by tears and a sense of closure that had been missing for decades. In the weeks that followed, the airport underwent a transformation. The eerie occurrences and sightings gradually ceased, and the lingering presence of lost souls seemed to have finally found peace. The once abandoned wing was renovated and reopened, and a memorial dedicated to the lost children was erected in the terminal. As I stood in the now restored airport terminal, I couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. I had stumbled upon a true horror story that had unfolded over a century, but through determination and compassion, we had brought it to a poignant and peaceful conclusion. My night at the airport in 1897 words had been a journey into the unknown, where I had encountered restless spirits, uncovered a heartbreaking mystery, and ultimately helped a mother and daughter find the closure they so desperately needed. It was a story that would stay with me for the rest of my life, a reminder that sometimes, even in the darkest of places, there is hope and redemption. As I sit here in the dim glow of my flickering candle, the memories of that fateful night come rushing back to me. It was a night like any other, or so I thought, when I stumbled upon the most sinister secret of my life, the haunted doll that would forever haunt my dreams. It all began on a rainy evening in the autumn of 2012. I was an antique dealer, always on the lookout for hidden treasures in the forgotten corners of the world. On this particular day, I received a tip from a colleague about an estate sale in the outskirts of town. The old man who had lived there for decades had recently passed away, and his entire estate was being auctioned off. It was rumored that he had a vast collection of rare and peculiar items, and my curiosity got the best of me. The rain was relentless as I made my way to the desolate mansion. The trees lining the winding road seemed to reach out with skeletal branches, casting eerie shadows in the fading light. The house itself was a looming, decrepit structure, the kind that appeared straight out of a Gothic novel. The windows were shattered, and the paint had long peeled away, leaving the facade a ghostly gray. I entered cautiously, my boots echoing on the creaking wooden floors. The inside was no less ominous than the outside. Dusty chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their crystals long tarnished. The walls were adorned with faded portraits of long-dead ancestors, their eyes following me with a spectral gaze. My fellow collectors were already there, whispering in hushed tones about the mysterious items they hoped to acquire. I, however, had come for one thing in particular, the doll. It was said to be a cursed relic, a malevolent entity that had tormented the old man until his dying breath. The doll was rumored to have a vile aura, and its presence had cast a pall over the entire estate. As the auction began, I watched with bated breath as the doll was brought to the center of the room. It was a grotesque sight, a porcelain figure with cracked skin and a twisted grin. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow me, and a shiver ran down my spine. The bidding started, and my heart raced as I raised my paddle. The bidding war for the doll was fierce, but I was determined to possess it. I had heard tales of its dark power, and I wanted to uncover the truth behind the whispers. With each bid, the atmosphere in the room grew more tense, as if the very air had thickened with malevolence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I emerged victorious. I clutched the doll tightly in my gloved hand as I made my way back to my carriage. The rain had not abated, and the storm seemed to rage in response to my new acquisition. The doll felt cold and lifeless, yet there was an undeniable presence about it that sent shivers down my spine. Once I arrived home, I placed the doll on a dusty old shelf in my study. Its sinister grin seemed to mock me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake. That night, I retired to my bedroom, but sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned, haunted by nightmares of the doll. In my dreams, the doll came to life, its porcelain limbs moving with an unnatural grace. It whispered dreadful secrets into my ear, promising unspeakable horrors. I awoke in a cold sweat, the echoes of its sinister laughter still ringing in my ears. As the days turned into weeks, I became increasingly obsessed with the doll. I could no longer focus on my work, and my once thriving antique business began to wither away. The doll's presence seemed to seep into every corner of my life, like a shadowy specter that refused to be banished. I decided to delve into the history of the doll, hoping to uncover the source of its malevolence. My research led me to a series of chilling discoveries. It turned out that the doll had a dark and sordid past. It had been created by a deranged doll maker in the late 19th century, a man rumored to have practiced dark arts and black magic. Legend had it that the doll had been used in a sinister ritual, imbuing it with the soul of a malevolent spirit. The spirit was said to be that of a vengeful child, trapped for eternity within the porcelain prison of the doll. The doll's sole purpose was to torment and haunt its owner, exacting a terrible revenge for the sins of the living. My investigations led me to a cryptic journal hidden within the old man's estate. It detailed his descent into madness as he tried to rid himself of the cursed doll. The journal spoke of sleepless nights, whispered threats, and the feeling of being constantly watched. It was clear that the doll's dark influence had driven him to the brink of insanity. Desperate to free myself from the doll's grip, I consulted experts in the occult and paranormal. They warned me that the doll was a vessel for a malevolent entity, and that severing its connection to the spirit would be a perilous undertaking. But I was determined to rid myself of this cursed relic, no matter the cost. The ritual to cleanse the doll was a harrowing ordeal. It involved incantations, protective circles, and the burning of herbs with roots in ancient folklore. As I performed the ritual, I could feel the doll's malevolent presence intensifying. It resisted with all its might, its porcelain limbs thrashing about in a grotesque parody of life. But I was relentless, fueled by a determination to break the curse that had ensnared me. As the ritual reached its climax, a blinding light erupted from the doll, and a deafening scream pierced the air. It was as if the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. When the light finally faded, the doll lay still, its once twisted grin replaced by a serene expression. It seemed lifeless, no longer possessed by the vengeful spirit that had plagued me. I breathed a sigh of relief, believing that the nightmare was finally over. But the horrors were far from finished. As I turned to leave the room, I heard a faint whisper, a chilling voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. It was the voice of the malevolent spirit, and it spoke with a seething rage that sent shivers down my spine. "You may have banished me from the doll, but you cannot banish me from your life," it hissed. "I will haunt you until the end of your days, for you have meddled in forces beyond your comprehension." The room grew cold, and I could feel the spirit's presence closing in on me. I ran from the room, slamming the door shut behind me, but I knew that there was no escape. The curse of the haunted doll had become my own, and I was condemned to a life of torment and terror. I sit here now, in the dim glow of my flickering candle, knowing that the malevolent spirit still lurks in the shadows, waiting to strike when I least expect it. The haunted doll may be gone, but its curse lives on, a chilling reminder of the price I paid for my curiosity. So, dear reader, heed my warning, beware the allure of the unknown, for it may lead you down a path from which there is no return. The haunted doll is a testament to the darkness that lurks in the corners of our world, a darkness that can consume even the most steadfast of souls. The wind howled through the broken windows of the abandoned hospital, sending shivers down my spine as I stepped cautiously through the decaying doorway. My flashlight cast eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper, revealing the remnants of a place that time had long forgotten. My friends and I had always been drawn to the macabre, seeking out the darkest and most chilling places to explore. This abandoned hospital, rumored to be haunted, had piqued our curiosity for months, and tonight, we were finally here. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and mildew as I took my first step into the dark corridor. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked back at my friends, Sarah and Alex, who were equally as nervous as I was. We had heard stories about this place, stories of ghostly apparitions, strange sounds in the dead of night, and inexplicable occurrences. But we were determined to uncover the truth. As we ventured deeper into the hospital, the silence was deafening. The only sound was the echo of our own footsteps on the cracked linoleum floors. Dust-covered medical equipment and rusted gurneys lay scattered about, remnants of a time when this place had been a hub of healing. It was hard to believe that such a sterile environment had turned into a forsaken wasteland. Our first destination was the operating room, a place where life and death had once hung in a delicate balance. The room was in shambles, with shattered glass and broken equipment strewn across the floor. I couldn't help but shudder as I imagined the surgeries that had taken place here, the pain and suffering that had filled this room. Suddenly, a low, eerie moan echoed through the hallway, causing all of us to freeze in our tracks. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, a mix of agony and despair that seemed to reverberate from the very walls themselves. Panic gripped my heart as I realized that there was no logical explanation for that sound. It couldn't have come from any of us, and there was no one else in this forsaken place. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Alex nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I heard it. Let's just keep going. Maybe it was just the wind or something." I wanted to believe him, to dismiss the sound as a trick of the imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. We pressed on, determined to reach the heart of the hospital, the psychiatric ward. The psychiatric ward had been notorious for its inhumane treatments and the suffering of its patients. The stories we had heard were chilling, tales of electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and the screams of the mentally ill echoing through the night. As we approached the entrance to the ward, a heavy, oppressive atmosphere settled around us like a suffocating blanket. The door to the psychiatric ward creaked open, revealing a pitch-black darkness that seemed to swallow the feeble beam of my flashlight. I hesitated, my heart pounding, but curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. Sarah and Alex followed closely behind, their flashlights illuminating the oppressive gloom. The ward was a maze of empty cells, each one a tiny, grim chamber that had once held the most tortured souls. The walls were covered in graffiti, the scribbles of vandals and ghost hunters who had come before us. As we moved deeper into the ward, the temperature seemed to drop, and a chill ran down my spine. Then, we heard it again, the mournful wail, louder this time, echoing through the corridors. There was no mistaking it. It was the sound of a woman's voice, filled with anguish and despair. It seemed to be coming from one of the cells ahead of us. We approached the cell cautiously, our flashlights trembling in our hands. The cell door was ajar, and inside, we saw a figure huddled in the corner, her back to us. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her shoulders shaking with each heart-wrenching cry. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaking. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't respond, but the sobbing continued. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. Sarah and Alex followed suit, their expressions a mixture of fear and concern. I reached out a trembling hand to touch the figure's shoulder, but before I could make contact, she turned around, and I froze in horror. The woman's face was a grotesque mask of agony, her eyes hollow and empty. Her skin was pallid, stretched tight over her skeletal frame, and her hair hung in greasy tangles. She let out a blood-curdling scream, and I stumbled backward, falling to the floor in shock. Sarah and Alex were just as terrified as I was, and we scrambled to our feet, racing back the way we had come. The wails of the tormented woman echoed through the ward, following us as we fled. We didn't stop until we had reached the entrance of the hospital. Gasping for breath, we stumbled out into the moonlit night, the cold air a welcome relief from the oppressive darkness within. We never looked back, never returned to that accursed place. To this day, I can't explain what we witnessed in that abandoned hospital. Was it the restless spirit of a tortured soul trapped in a perpetual nightmare? Or was it something even more sinister, lurking in the shadows, waiting for unsuspecting explorers like us? One thing is certain, that night forever changed us, and we learned the hard way that some mysteries are better left unsolved, some horrors better left undiscovered. The rain fell relentlessly against the windshield as I drove down the desolate highway, the only sound in the world outside the confines of my car. It was a moonless night, the darkness stretching endlessly in every direction. The lone beam of my headlights carved a narrow path through the inky abyss, revealing nothing but the reflection of raindrops on the asphalt. I had been driving for hours, my eyelids heavy with exhaustion, when I saw the flickering neon sign up ahead. It read, "The Whispering Pines Motel," and it seemed like a lifeline in the night. My gas gauge was flirting dangerously close to empty, and I couldn't afford to be stranded on this lonely stretch of road. As I pulled into the motel's parking lot, the tires of my car sent up a spray of water from the rain-soaked ground. The place looked ancient, its neon sign struggling to stay lit. The building itself was a one-story, weathered structure with a faded coat of white paint. There was something unsettling about it, something that sent a shiver down my spine. But I had no other option. I had to stop for the night. I stepped out of my car and ran through the rain to the front office. The raindrops felt like cold fingers on my skin, and the wind howled through the trees, making me feel utterly alone. I pushed open the creaking door of the office and stepped inside. The interior was equally as unsettling as the exterior. It was dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and an old-fashioned check-in counter that looked like it had seen better days. A bell sat on the counter, and I rang it, the sound echoing eerily in the empty room. Moments later, an elderly man appeared from a back room. He was thin and hunched, with a mop of gray hair and weary eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of secrets. He greeted me with a crooked smile that did little to ease my unease. "Can I help you, stranger?" he asked, his voice raspy and low. "I need a room for the night," I replied, trying to sound confident despite the eerie atmosphere. The old man nodded and began to fill out a guest registration form. As he scribbled down my information, I couldn't help but glance around the office. There were old photographs on the walls, faded with time, showing the motel in its heyday. The people in the pictures looked happy, carefree, but there was something unsettling about their smiles, as if they were hiding something. The old man handed me a key and pointed down a dimly lit hallway. "Room 13, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's at the end of the hall." I took the key and headed down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The carpet was worn and threadbare, and the walls were adorned with peeling wallpaper that seemed to absorb what little light there was. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking in the shadows just out of sight. Room 13 was at the end of the hallway, and I slid the key into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a room that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The furniture was old and mismatched, and the bedspread was faded and worn. But at that point, I was too tired to care. I just needed a place to sleep. I tossed my bag onto the bed and headed into the bathroom to freshen up. The mirror was cracked, and the sink was stained with age. As I splashed water on my face, I couldn't help but feel like the room had a heaviness to it, as if it were holding onto the memories of all the travelers who had passed through over the years. I climbed into bed and pulled the covers up to my chin, trying to push aside my unease. The rain continued to fall outside, its steady rhythm lulling me to sleep. But just as I was on the brink of slumber, I heard it, the faintest whispering coming from somewhere in the room. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was empty, and there was no one else in sight. But the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. It was as if 100 voices were speaking in hushed tones, their words indistinct but filled with a palpable sense of dread. I reached for the bedside lamp and turned it on, casting a warm glow over the room. But the whispering didn't stop. It seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, as if the very building was alive with secrets. Terrified, I grabbed my bag and made a hasty exit from the room. As I rushed down the hallway, the whispering followed me, growing louder and more desperate with each step. I burst into the front office, where the old man was still sitting behind the counter. "Something's in that room," I stammered, my voice trembling. "I can hear it whispering." The old man looked at me with a knowing expression, his weary eyes filled with sorrow. "You're not the first to hear it," he said softly. "It's been here for as long as I can remember." I demanded a refund and fled the motel, the rain still falling as I got back into my car. I drove for miles until I found another motel, one that was brightly lit and bustling with people. I spent the night there, the whispering of the Whispering Pines Motel haunting my dreams. In the morning, I continued my journey, putting the strange encounter behind me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled upon something sinister that rainy night, a secret that the Whispering Pines Motel held in its walls, a secret that would forever haunt anyone who dared to stop there after midnight. The old farm had always been a place of mystery and unease. Nestled deep in the countryside, its dilapidated barns and overgrown fields had long been abandoned by the previous owners, leaving it to decay in the embrace of time. But when I found myself in desperate need of a job, the promise of night work there seemed like a godsend. Little did I know, it would turn into a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. My first night on the farm was as eerie as one would expect. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. The wind whistled through the trees, creating an otherworldly symphony of creaks and moans. I tried to shake off the unease as I made my way to the farmhouse, clutching my flashlight tightly. The farm's owner, a grizzled man named Mr. Anderson, met me at the door with a tired smile. "Glad you could make it," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "We've been having some trouble with the animals lately. They get restless at night, you see." He handed me a set of keys and a rundown of my duties, checking on the animals, making sure the doors were locked, and keeping an eye out for any intruders. It all seemed straightforward enough, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of fear that sent shivers down my spine. As I made my way to the barn, the darkness seemed to thicken around me. The only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath my boots and the distant hoot of an owl. When I finally reached the barn, I could hear the low, mournful moans of the cows inside. I hesitated for a moment before swinging the door open and stepping inside. The sight that greeted me was enough to make my blood run cold. The cows, normally docile creatures, were in a frenzy. They thrashed and bellowed, their eyes wide with terror. I shone my flashlight around the barn, trying to see what had spooked them, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. I quickly checked their food and water, hoping that would calm them down, but it had no effect. It was as if some unseen force had taken hold of them, filling them with a primal fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking in the shadows just out of reach. I decided to leave the barn and check on the other animals. The chickens were in a similar state of distress, flapping their wings and squawking as if they were under attack. I couldn't understand it. Nothing seemed amiss, and yet the animals were clearly terrified. I continued my rounds, growing more and more uneasy with each passing minute. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and the farm felt like a different place in the darkness. The wind carried strange whispers, and the trees seemed to sway to some sinister rhythm. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking in the shadows just out of reach. As I made my way back to the farmhouse, I noticed a light flickering in one of the windows. My heart raced as I approached, fearing the worst. But when I looked inside, I saw Mr. Anderson huddled in a corner with a lantern, his eyes wide with fear. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked up at me, his face pale. "I don't know," he whispered. "I've heard strange noises in the night, and I've seen things that shouldn't be here." I wanted to press him for more information, but before I could, there was a loud crash from outside. We both turned towards the window, our hearts pounding. The night seemed to come alive with strange sounds and eerie whispers. We decided to investigate, grabbing our flashlights and cautiously making our way outside. The farm was bathed in an unnatural glow, and the air was heavy with an oppressive energy. As we rounded the corner of the barn, we came face to face with a sight that would haunt me forever. Standing in the middle of the field was a figure, tall and shadowy, its form shifting and contorting in the moonlight. It had a grotesque, inhuman quality, like a nightmare brought to life. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its mere presence sent waves of dread crashing over us. Without a word, we turned and ran back to the farmhouse, slamming the door shut behind us. We could hear the creature outside, its footsteps heavy and deliberate as it circled the building. Mr. Anderson and I huddled in the corner, our flashlights trained on the door, praying that it would hold. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the creature's presence a looming threat that refused to fade. We could hear it scratching at the walls, its guttural growls sending chills down our spines. Hours passed, but it showed no sign of leaving. As dawn approached, the creature finally retreated, disappearing into the fields as mysteriously as it had appeared. Mr. Anderson and I were left shaken and terrified, our minds unable to comprehend the horrors we had witnessed. In the days that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened, but there were no answers to be found. The animals remained in a state of distress, and the farm seemed to be cursed by an unspeakable evil. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer, and Mr. Anderson felt the same. We packed our belongings and left the farm behind, vowing never to return. But the memory of that night would forever haunt my dreams, a reminder that some horrors are best left in the darkness, hidden away on that old, cursed farm. Even now, years later, I can still hear the faint whispers of the wind, carrying with them the echoes of that night. And I know that the farm will forever be a place of darkness and dread, a place where the line between reality and nightmare blurs, and where the horrors of the past still linger in the shadows.